Hello my beautiful bookish friends and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing my 2019 end of the year wrap up. I have never done one of these on BookTube, so I have my list of books I read this year, what I rated them, and I'll give you a little bit of why I rated them that way. I don't want this video to be too long, but I feel like inevitably it's going to be. So let's just jump right into it. So the first book I read in 2019 is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, I believe is her last name. And I gave this book a 4 out of 5. This book was wonderful and amazing and fantastical and really got me into fantasy this year. But I only gave it a 4 out of 5 because the world building took so long. And I guess that's just the nature of the story with the way that the plot goes. I don't want to give too much away in case you haven't read it. But there's so many crisscrossing storylines and different characters. It was kind of hard to keep storylines straight. But overall, I really enjoyed the book. And once I got to page like 200, I kind of flew through the rest of it. The next book I read was actually one of my favorite ones of 2019, and that is The Bone Witch. I gave this a 4 out of 5. Just because, again, the world building took a really long time, but this is a series, so it does get better as it goes, so I highly recommend you read it, especially if you're into fantasy or witchy stuff. And I am not someone who's into high fantasy with like different languages and things like that, but I really got into this book and I can't wait for the third book in the series, even though it's the end. I'm very excited to read it and kind of move on with the Shadow Glass. But yeah, I will definitely be reading The Bone Witch again and annotating it sometime in 2020. The next ones I read were actually the Wonder Woman comics. These were the DC Rebirths. I read 1 through 5 and I gave them all a 5 out of 5 stars. Yeah, 5 out of 5 stars. I love Wonder Woman, I always have, and these stories were just amazingly done with her finding out who she is and why she's the way she is and why people hate her, and Steve Trevor's in it. And it's more of a modern take. I believe the war, instead of it being World War II, is in Iraq or Afghanistan, and is very much more modern. So I really loved it, and I love Diana Prince as a character in these books, and I love her and Steve's relationship in it as well. Then we have Captain America Corps, which I read I think in like February, which is another Marvel comic. Wonder Woman's DC, but this one was my first Marvel comic that I've ever gotten, and I really liked it. I got it in Disneyland. I'm not sure where you can get it from, but I gave it a 4 out of 5 just because it was a little bit confusing, and I thought that some of the time jumps back and forth were a little hard to follow, but overall it was a pretty solid story. The next series of books I read was Magic Tree House books 1 through 8. These are children's books I really liked when I was younger, and I had books 1 through like 40, I think, and they were just taking up a lot of space on my shelf, so I decided to read them and ultimately unhaul them to my local library just as a donation, because our library isn't very well funded, so them getting new books is not often. And even though these books are not brand new, they are in really good shape. So I gave the whole box set of 8 5 out of 5. They're a great children's book and a great way to get kids into reading. And for me, they were really repetitive because I was reading them back to back to back. But for a little kid, they would be great, and I enjoyed them. I think they're awesome. Then I read one of my most disappointing books of the year, and that was Suicide Notes from Beautiful Girls. I gave this a 2 out of 5 because I went on and on about this book in my wrap-up, which I will leave all of my wrap-ups linked down below if you want more information on these books. But I hated this book. Like, 2 might be generous. So many of the characters were so toxic and unlikable, and I don't think it was meant to be that way. I think a few of them were, but not all of them. And I just hated it. There was so much manipulation and being like, it was like Pretty Little Liars on a really cheaply done scale. So I did not enjoy this book at all, and I got rid of it like real quick. So then I went into the Dead Is series, which I have been reading since middle school. I've restarted it several times because I got the first 2 books when I was in middle school, and then I finally got all of them this year. and I read Dead Is So last year and Dead Is Just a Rumor, and both of those I gave 5 out of 5 because Marlene Perez's writing is amazing, and I love the paranormal mystery that goes with it all, and all the characters and the psychic elements. They're just really fun and cool, and they're a good easy read for me. I can usually read them in about a day, but the whole series is awesome, and it's right there. It's all those brightly colored ones. The next one I read is Truly Devious, which I gave a 4 out of 5. It was a little slow to start, and that seems to be like something I really dislike in books, is a slow start. But once it really got going, I truly enjoyed this book. I think all the characters having their own special talents and being in this kind of remote place gives way for a really dynamic, in-depth story. So truly like that book and can't wait to read the rest of this series. Then I read Once Upon a Dream, which is a Disney twisted tale. This one is about Maleficent Aurora. Amazing, amazing book. One that you really have to pay attention to, which I kind of like in certain books. So I gave it a 5 out of 5. Then I read Bombshells United Volume 2, which I gave a 5 out of 5 as well. This one focuses more on Batwoman and her love interest, who is a female, and it takes place during I believe it's the Spanish Civil War. And it's just an awesome story about them overcoming oppression and learning to work with their villains and turning them into allies. And you kind of have to be wary of everyone. Black Adam is in this story, which that movie is coming out, I believe, next year or in 2021. But I loved the story, and it was great. I love the Bombshells in general. Then I also read the Harley Quinn Rebirth Volume 2. This was just continuing on with Harley and the Joker story. This one was very violent and very sexual, so I gave it a 5 out of 5. It was true to Harley brand. I mean, Harley Quinn is super sexualized in any facet usually, but it was super duper good. Love those comics. And then one of my favorite books of the year that is so hyped, it's The Wicked Deep. I understand why everyone loves this book now. It was so sad. It made me want to cry, and I did, and I was so sad when it was over, and I definitely want to do a reread of it and annotate it. So I love that book, love Shay Earnshaw's writing, and definitely want to read The Winterwood. And then I also read A Danger to Herself and Others, which coincidentally enough, my best friend in college, her aunt wrote this book, and I did not know it until we started talking about it the one day. It's an amazing book. It deals so much with mental illness and where mental illness comes from. Like, is it hereditary, or is it caused by traumas in your life or pressure put on you that eventually makes you crack, in a sense? It was a super in-depth look into that, and I won't give away what mental illness she has because that's part of the book. Or does she even have a mental illness? You do not know. You have to read it. So good. I'm so glad I got it, and the cover is absolutely beautiful. I love it. So 5 out of 5. Another favorite book of mine this year was The Room on the Rue Meal. Amazing historical fiction about a woman during World War II. So much happens in that book. It is loosely based on a real person and real events that happened. I cried so much at the end of this book. It was an immediate 5 out of 5. It was so fast-paced and moving. I think I read it in about a day or two, and it was one of those books where I went to bed late and woke up early just to read it. I adore this book. Next, I started stalking Jack the Ripper, which I gave a 4.5 out of 5, mainly because it was slow building up, but the Jack the Ripper case has always intrigued me, and the fact that it's still truly unsolved is something that's always grabbed my attention. So reading a fictional story about how it could potentially be solved and covered up kind of was amazing. It's such a good book if you haven't read it. I know some people really don't like this series, but I truly enjoyed it. And then we have The Widow's House. This is a psychological thriller that has some paranormal elements to it with ghosts and stories of the past coming into the present. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. I truly enjoyed it. It was a really good, I think, representation of like postpartum depression and again, mental illness. The next book I read was Nerve, and I had seen the movie, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 because it was so very different than the movie. At first, I was really confused as to why it was so different, but I mean, it was different. Like, I didn't think I would like it at first, and then as I kept reading, I was like, this is so crazy. And her partner being the kind of like Dave Franco character in the movie, it was just really different. I loved it. I don't remember a whole lot about this book other than the fact that I really liked it, but I eventually unhauled it just because I knew I wasn't going to read it again. Then I read The After Party, which is again a historical fiction, and I gave this a 3.5 out of 5. This book did not meet my expectations based on the synopsis. It was very confusing, and I thought it was supposed to be more like a thriller type book, but it was not. It was kind of like a one-sided friendship sort of thing. Again, very much like Suicide Notes for Beautiful Girls, that it was like a toxic relationship, and it just didn't come across to me the way I think it was supposed to. The next books I read were Magic Tree House books 9 and 10, and I gave each of these 3 out of 5 stars, mainly because they just were really repetitive of the first ones. Even reading from a elementary to middle school range, I think that if someone were to get these books, you would realize you're kind of reading the same thing over and over again. So I wasn't really impressed with these as I was the first 8. But yeah, these ones also were unhauled and donated. Then I read Tale as Old as Time, which is a Disney Twisted Tale. This is the Beauty and the Beast one, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. It was so good. The Beast being a little bit more fleshed out as a character. You hear from him a lot more. And I also watched the live action movie while I was reading this, so I could kind of visualize the scenes a little bit more, but it was so dark and twisted and different and took on so many real life issues, which these books usually do. I fell thoroughly in love with them and highly recommend them to anybody. Then another favorite book of mine this year, which was Legendary, which is the second book in the Caraval series. I have ranted and raved about this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. So good. Love Damien, love Julian, love Donatella, still hate Scarlet. Moving on. I continued in the Dead Is series and read Dead Is Not an Option, which I gave a 5 out of 5, and Dead Is a Battlefield, which is 4 out of 5. These books finished up, I believe. One of them finished up one storyline, and another kind of was a spin-off but within the same series. I really liked it. It was pretty good. Dead Is a Battlefield was definitely less of my favorite than the original Dead Is series, but I'm happy I got the whole series and read it because I love it, and I'll probably read it again at some point. Then I read The Murder in the Rue Morgue. This was a short story. It's an Edgar Allan Poe. I gave this a 2 out of 5. I usually am a big Poe fan, but this was not the move for me. It was weird, like weirder than someone's heart being under the floorboards. Just like not what I thought it was gonna be. Then I read Delirium, which I gave 3.5 out of 5. I think I mentioned in my wrap up for this book that I'm just not a dystopian fan, and I thought that this YA kind of dystopia love story would like maybe turn me onto it a little bit, or you know, I would at least like this series, and I was not impressed with the writing. The ending kind of sucked. The story building was just really repetitive to me, so I'm hoping the rest of the series isn't like this, or I will be DNFing for sure. Then I read Girl Stolen, which I gave it a 2 out of 5. I usually like stories about kidnapping and people trying to get out of that situation, but this, let me tell you, hearing about a young girl slowly developing Stockholm Syndrome is not, stop writing that, like, stop it. I did not like it, the fact that she was kind of falling in love with her captor, or one of her captors. It just wasn't, I didn't like it. So then I read the last 2 books in the Dead Is series, which I gave 5 out of 5 respectively. I read Dead Is a Killer Tune, which was probably one of my favorites. It has to deal with the Pied Piper, which I really didn't know a lot about, and reading the story, it's super creepy and weird, so I really like that one. And then Dead Is Just a Dream was also another really creepy and weird concept, but dealt with a few different not historical like different cultural differences and different paranormal things. So it was super cool. I loved it. Great book. And those were both really short reads. Then I read The Drowning, which was like a surprise 5 out of 5 for me. I read this book in a day for Spookathon, I think. And this book like floored me. It was so good. There were so many twists and turns. If you like $1 Million Listing, you will like this book. Very much the same kind of personalities in this book that are in that show. Just blew my freaking mind, I'm not gonna lie. So I read The Girl Who Was Supposed to Die, which in my wrap-up, I could not remember for the life of me what happened in this book. Yeah, it was actually better than I remember. It's a 3.5 out of 5 for me. It has a little bit to do with like anthrax, and there's some conspiracies and some amnesia in there. So definitely kind of cool if you're into that sort of government conspiracy stuff, but some of it just didn't make sense to me. Then I read Hocus Pocus, also for Spookathon. These are basically all my Spookathon books. Loved it, 5 out of 5. It's exactly like the movie. What more can I say? Then we have Fix Her Up, which is the first adult romance book I have ever read in my whole life, and I freaking loved it. 11 out of 5. If I could, just so good. This is probably my favorite book of 2019. Travis Ford is the best character ever. You can fight me till the end of time on that. Georgie is amazing. She's a great heroine in this story, so love it. Love all of the things. Then I read Seafire, which another surprise favorite for me this year. I gave it a 4 out of 5. So much awesome representation. There's bi and lesbian and straight, and everybody is kind of included in this story. There is some grieving in there, but honestly the series is going to be awesome if it continues the way it's going. So 4 out of 5. Alright, so clearly it's a different day when I am filming this, but yesterday was Christmas Eve and we had to leave the house while I was filming. So let's finish up this wrap up. My 47th book that I wanted to tell you guys about is Merida Tidebreaker, and I gave this a 2 stars out of 5. I was highly disappointed in this graphic novel. I really thought it would be one of my favorites of the year and be much more in depth, but it was a very surface level story that I felt like could have been explored more and gone a different direction. So I was a little disappointed in that, so I only give it a 2 out of 5. Then I have Tell Me Three Things, which is actually a contemporary novel that surprised me. It's centered all around grief and friendship, and there was a little bit of love in the end. Hunting Prince Dracula, which is part of the Stalking Jack the Ripper series, and this book took a really long time to get going, but once it did, for me, it was a total 5 out of 5. There were so many new characters and plot lines, and truly the end was a big twist, so I won't give it away, but it's a good one. Then we have the second book in the Bone Witch series, which is The Heart Forger, and like I said before, The Bone Witch is just one of my favorite books ever, and The Heart Forger was a complete 5 out of 5. It was so amazing. Being able to skip that kind of world building element and jump right back into the new part of the story, I just loved it. The story was so much deeper, it explained so much and answered so many questions. And the next one, I'm sure, is just going to kind of wrap everything up, but it is such a good book. Anything by Rin Chupeco that I've ever read, I truly enjoy, so I am hoping to get more of her work as I go, but I just loved that book. Then I read The Loveliest Chocolate Shop in Paris. This book was not with a synopsis set at all. It was completely different, but I still really ended up loving it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5. Just because I really wanted the synopsis to be more of what it was like, but it was slightly different and focused on some different things, and it wasn't as happy and light as I thought it was going to be. It was actually fairly heavy and dealt with a lot of issues that are still relevant right now, and there was a little bit of grief and death in there, but overall it's a great book. Then I read Witch. This is the first book in the series, and I gave this one like a 3.5 out of 5. There were just some parts in the book that made me slightly uncomfortable, the way they were describing like a teenage girl's body. A lot about just being like very curvy, and they kind of like harped on it in a weird way, not in like a, oh, like she was curvy, and then that's where it was. It was like it was constantly stated over and over and over and over, and then you look at the characters on the back and the cover and they are very much like very small waisted, very wide hips, very big breasted, and it was just really weird the way it was written. And then the final book that I have completed right now is These Witches Don't Burn, which I gave a 4 out of 5. Some of it was a little slow, but the end was really great. The twists and turns, the kind of things being dealt with. I thought it was going to be more of a surface level kind of light read, but it definitely wasn't. And a lot of people had said that. And I think it's a great novel. I love it. I would definitely like to give it another shot to read it again, because I really wasn't in a witchy mood to read it when I did. But yeah, I would love to give it another shot some other time. And right now I am currently reading Reflection, which is another Disney Twisted Tale. So far it's about like a 3 out of 5 for me. It is fast moving, but it's kind of slowed down a bit after the first 100 pages. And I am also just starting one day in December. So I very well may add to this video at the end to review whatever books that I have left, but for right now that is all I have. I have completed 53 books as of December 25th, and hopefully I will have a few more for you guys, but I surpassed my reading goal of 50 books, so I am hoping to at least get to 55 by the end of the month.